In this video, I'm going to be talking you through the share of search methodology we developed here at WeDiscover. The idea is I'll give you a little bit more context and explanation to some of the information in this slide deck and hopefully bring it to life a little bit more for you. Cool, so where to start? The best place to start, I guess, is what is share of search? If you work in marketing data or you're familiar with the marketing industry, you may have heard of the term share of voice before or market share. Share of search is simply another indicator similar to these that is slightly different mathematically. If we think first about what share of voice is, it's simply the number of brand mentions that your brand receives relative to the total number of brand mentions for you and your competitors within your market/industry category. Share of search is the same thing, but looking at the total number of searches that your brand receives relative to the total number of searches for your brand and your competitors within your market/category. Simply put, it's an indicator of the proportion of total searches in a market that your brand gets. So why is this useful and why is this something we should be thinking about when looking at marketing data? Share of search has been shown to be a leading indicator of your market share. Research conducted by the Les Binet Group showed that for the phone market, share of search was a good leading indicator of what happened to their market share. In this instance, it was around a 6-month kind of lead to lag kind of effect. They also looked at the automotive industry and noticed for a certain brand within there that their share of search was also a leading indicator of market share, albeit a slightly different lag time. Another reason that we might want to look at share of search is it lets you know how your brand is performing relative to your competitors. Commonly, when we look at Google Ads, we can think about things like impression share, absolute top of page rate, when trying to understand the competition. But that doesn't give us a holistic view of what the overall competitor landscape looks like and how you're trending within that landscape. One of the good things about share of search is it's not dependent on specific keywords or things like that. It's looking at your brand more holistically. What that enables us to do is see how our brand is trending over time and therefore understand how your business is growing relative to similar competitors or the overall market. This is really helpful when trying to kind of make strategic decisions on where we distribute marketing budget and things like that. So share of search is a really powerful tool when considering all of the different points from the above. What I want to do in the rest of this presentation is take you through the methodology that we've designed, talk about the data sources and some of their limitations, and then start to think about some practical examples of where we could use this with some different marketing or different markets. So starting with the methodology. When we were looking to design this, there are multiple different data sources we can consider. Google Analytics data could be helpful, Search Console data, and there are other data sources that are mentioned here that we looked into in a lot of detail. We kind of settled on a very simple approach that is leveraged simply around two Google-based tools. Google Trends data, which if you haven't used it before, enables you to look at the popularity of a search over a period of time and goes back as far as 2004/5. And historic keyword planner data, which is a way to get an idea of monthly search volume for a given search term for the last kind of 3 or 4 years. So if we focus on these two different data sources and try and understand the limitations and how we can leverage them, we are able to get to a point where we can understand the share of search methodology that we've taken here. So starting with Google Trends. Google Trends is fundamentally a tool, as I said, to understand the popularity of a search. And within that, there are two different ways that you can search for a given brand or topic. One is terms and one is topics. If you're familiar with Google Ads, terms are very similar to kind of match types. So the idea is there are two different ways you can search. You can do a simple search, which is equivalent, I guess, to broad match, where we say, okay, I want to look at John Lewis. I'll therefore match for things like shop John Lewis furniture, Lewis John. And then there's also a phrase search, where we basically wrap whatever we're looking at within quotation marks. And in the context of kind of match types, that's most similar to phrase or exact, where we're only going to see things like John Lewis shop, John Lewis furniture. We're not going to get kind of manipulation of that, the order of those two words. Topics are a group of terms that share the same concept in any single language. So if we think about the topic of London, people searching for the capital of the UK or London in different languages will all trigger for that topic. Most of the time in the share of search context, what we want to do is look at phrase searches because they're most indicative of the overall searches for the brand. However, there are instances where we might not want to do that, where the brand name itself is a little bit generic or broad in its nature. So if we think about the brand Next, people might be searching for Next in a variety of different contexts and not actually looking for the brand. In that context, we might want to leverage topics because they'll be more representative of the actual brand searches themselves. We've done a few comparisons of multiple different brands to try and understand the difference between terms and topics. And with brands like John Lewis, IKEA, you'll see that the difference is very, very minor, if anything. Whereas for the brands that are more broad, as I said, like Next, the difference between the topic and the actual search term might differ a little bit more substantially. Cool. So that's a little bit of an understanding of how the tool works. What are some of the limitations of the source? Fundamentally, the data provided by Google Trends is indexed and it's sampled. If we think about what the index means, we basically don't know the actual search volume for a given term. We just have an idea of its popularity relative to a 0 to 100 index. And sampled means that instead of looking at all of the data that has ever existed, we get a proportion of the data to understand the popularity. So if we think about the image on the right here, we can think about the target population being all of the different searches within for a given word ever within the time frame you defined, and sample is just taking a subset of them to get an idea of the total popularity. So what we want to do here is unindex the data, because we think search volume is vital for understanding the overall market progression and how you're doing within that market, and also make sure that the sampling error that we're going to get out of Google Trends is acceptable and we understand it. So starting with the sampling error. To understand this, what we basically did is pulled Google Trends data at multiple different intervals and compared the difference between those different pulls to understand the error in the sample. And what we identified from this is when we took a brand which had relatively low monthly volume, so around 5,000 searches, and compared it to a brand that had very high monthly search volume, the associated error was much, much greater from a sampling perspective when looking at that low volume. On the left-hand side chart here, we see that the bounds of error relative to the average are much, much greater than for a high volume brand. From this, I think it can be concluded that share of search is only going to be applicable from a sampling perspective for higher monthly searches. So for brands that have significantly less monthly searches than, say, 100,000, we probably won't recommend this as an approach that we can even kind of explore. It's more for brands that have a minimum total search volume where we can start to think about share of search and leverage it. So that moves us on to the second source, which is Keyword Planner. How can we use Keyword Planner to unindex the data we get from Google Trends, and is that approach valid? So before we get into whether or not unindexing is a valid approach, I guess we need to understand the data available. Keyword Planner is a very valuable tool to understand the monthly search volume for a certain search term over time. So I think, as I said earlier, it can go up to the last 4 years. The only problem with this data is it's generally bucketed, i.e. Google does not provide the exact search volume for a term. It does it in a bucketed form. So let's give an example. Let's say over a 3-month period, you get 10,000 searches 1 month, 20,000 searches 1 month, and 15,000 searches 1 month. It may be that Google has buckets of 10,000 and 18,000. And basically, if you have the 15,000 searches, it would show as 18,000, even though we know the actual figure is much lower than that. The bucketing isn't that extreme in practical sense. I think it's around 15 to 80% in terms of the increments of the next total. So if we think about 20,000, it'll be around 18% lower the next bucket. So you're talking kind of around 17,000 would be the next bucket below that. Fundamentally, this isn't an issue that we can avoid. And when we actually look at kind of validating these figures for a couple of brands, we compared the Keyword Planner search volume that was being suggested relative to what was being seen in Search Console in a given month. And we saw the discrepancy generally was within 10% in both instances. So although a non-ideal situation, we think this is still valid, and we still look to use this to unindex the data that we get from Google Trends. So with that kind of validity put in place, what does this look like practically when applied to a couple of different scenarios? What we wanted to do here was take two different markets that are very different in their nature, to take a very established brand within a very established retail market, and take a more exciting new brand in a growing market to see what the differences in share of search are and how it can be leveraged. So starting with an established brand example, we wanted to look at John Lewis relative to a variety of different competitors. So we chose Currys, House of Fraser, Selfridges, and M&S. I think it's worth noting at this stage, we appreciate that there are other competitors in the brand. One of the benefits, I guess, of share of search is we can define as many competitors as we want and which ones are most relevant to us. So in the example that we'll move on to in a second, it might be that there are some key competitors that you think are missing, but we're doing that for specific reasons. We know in this instance that there may be other ones we'd want to look at, and depending on what your goal is for using this tool, we can leverage that in different ways. But in this example, we're just selecting 5 competitors in both cases and then looking at how that brand trends over time. But now, analysing this chart on the right-hand side, what we can basically see is the share of search for the different brands here and how it trends over a period of time. You'll notice on the right-hand side that John Lewis is this darker line, and it's relatively stable throughout the whole period. It seems to show some seasonal fluctuation around kind of the Christmas period, which you'd expect given the strong advertisements that John Lewis do around that time. But overall, it's very stable over this period. If we compare this to a recent kind of unicorn brand in Gymshark, where we're comparing to kind of Lululemon, Boohooman, Reebok, and Under Armour, we see its share of search is effectively non-existent. It was a very unknown brand in kind of the early 2000s. And as we kind of go into more recent periods, we see its share of search dramatically increase, as you'd expect, whilst other brands, maybe like Reebok, see their total share of search decrease quite significantly. On the previous slide, I mentioned that we are aware that there are other brands in these different markets. And in this specific context, I guess a brilliant example is Nike and Adidas. The reason we've excluded these from this view, and the reason that I think this is super valuable for the share of search methodology more broadly, is we know that Nike and Adidas have substantially more total searches than any of the other competitors in this brand. So we could include them in this context, but because it's so much greater, it would simply dwarf the view of everything else that's going on. We would not be able to get an understanding of how Gymshark is necessarily doing because it would just look minute compared to everything else in the market. Cool. So if we think about these as stack charts for the two different examples, you'll notice a few interesting trends. Overall, the retail brand, so the John Lewis example, is fairly stable over time. There are a few interesting instances within here. So, for example, House of Fraser, I know went into some financial difficulties around kind of the 2020 time, and you can see that in its total share of search. Similarly, for Gymshark, we see that Reebok, who was a dominant competitor in this example, slowly reduced its overall share of search, whilst Gymshark and Under Armour increased dramatically. And finally, this is where the unindexing approach that we've taken to share of search has become super powerful, because we can start to think about the total volume of a market or an industry, albeit an estimation, and then try and understand how we're doing from a total search perspective in that industry. It's worth noting that these y-axes are 1,000 divided by 1,000, just for interpretation. So this is actually 150 million that we're looking at here. But yeah, what you can basically see is that John Lewis seems to be, again, fairly stable, peaks around kind of the 2013 mark and is kind of leveling out. Whereas Gymshark has seen a total search, the Gymshark fitness market has seen a total increase in its overall search volume, which is super interesting to see. So the overall retail landscape that had John Lewis within it is stable, whereas the fitness or growing gym market has increased dramatically over the last kind of 5 to 10 years. From that, we can try to understand, okay, where is the opportunity within the market? Obviously, again, this is isolated to the specific competitors that we're choosing, but a super useful indication nonetheless. So what does all of this mean when combined together and when we're trying to analyze how we can leverage share of search? I think broadly in marketing, one of the greatest challenges for brands looking to grow is trying to understand how they're doing within their market and how they're doing relative to their competition. Where does your brand sit relative to your competitors, and how can we make strategic decisions at a top level to leverage some of the different instances here? It's been shown historically that if you want to increase your market share, you need to have an excess share of voice. Similarly with share of search, it might be the case that what we need to do is use share of search as an indicator of how aggressive or non-aggressive we need to be based on our share of market and the ambition of the business. It acts as a point of reference for overall performance and a leading indicator of the common things that really matter, like market share and share of voice. So by monitoring it and understanding how we're trending over a period of time, we can determine how aggressive we want to be or need to be in a market to drive sustained business growth. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out at WeDiscover.